Okay, today we're going to talk about metabolism and what metabolism is and how important it is within living systems and the reactions that are associated with it. And we're going to talk about enzymes and all sorts of things today. So, when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about the sum total of all the chemical reactions that are happening within a living system. Some chemical reactions are building things, some chemical reactions are breaking down things, some chemical reactions are storing energy, and some chemical reactions are releasing energy. Metabolism is the sum total of those reactions. Energy is extremely important, and how we get that energy, how we use that energy is extremely important because all of the functions of life require it. When we talk about energy, we say that ultimately all energy comes from the sun. There are a few situations, like for instance, deep sea ocean vents that don't get any sunlight, they get energy from chemicals in a process called chemosynthesis. But for us walking around the surface of the planet, we get all of our energy from the sun. And we get that through processes such as photosynthesis and cellular respiration that allow photosynthesis allows the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy. So we are converting into chemical energy in the process of photosynthesis. And it's extremely important because organisms eat plants and then we eat organisms, and that energy moves from organism to organism throughout a food chain. Some of that energy is used to power that particular organism's life function. So the energy converted by plants, the plants are using that energy to grow. They're storing some of that energy for later, and then some of that energy is lost as heat. And then if that bunny rabbit eats that bunny rabbit is using the energy from the plant to grow. It's going to store some of that energy, and then it's going to lose some energy as heat. And then if the fox eats the bunny rabbit, it's going to get all that bunny rabbit's energy and it's going to use it to grow. It's going to store some of that energy, and it'll lose some of it as heat. So the energy is passed and then throughout that food chain. So when we talk about chemical reactions, we're talking about the reactions within that living organism and how the energy that's being passed from organism to organism is released within that organism and stored within that organism. So some chemical reactions release energy and some chemical reactions store energy or need energy added before that they can proceed. So the example that we can talk about that is probably going to be the most obvious example is carbohydrate metabolism. So when we talk about carbohydrates, we're talking about those complex carbs. If you remember from last lecture, they're made of monomers, those simple sugars that are bound together. All right. Cellular respiration is a process that living organisms use. All living organisms that need oxygen to survive. So that if you are an organism that needs oxygen to live, you are using cellular respiration. And what we are doing with cellular respiration is we're taking the carbohydrates that we eat and we are breaking them down to make ATP. So for instance, if you eat a carbohydrate, your body through metabolic processes is going to break it down into glucose, a 6-carbon sugar. And through cellular respiration, we're going to take that 6-carbon sugar right there, and we're going to release energy through the process of cellular respiration. And that energy can then be used to power cellular processes. We talk about how carbohydrates are important for energy. It's not because carbohydrates power cellular processes. It's because the energy in carbohydrates is used to make ATP, and ATP powers cellular processes. Photosynthesis is another part of carbohydrate metabolism. In photosynthesis, we're storing solar energy into sugar. We are taking the energy from the sun and we're converting it, we're using it to convert carbon dioxide and water into that sugar. So we're storing that energy essentially in the bonds that are holding carbon dioxide and oxygen together, rearranged as sugar. Right? So we take the energy from the sun and we're joining these molecules together and we are getting sugar. All right. So in this one, we are building. And in this one, we are breaking sugar. All right. Now, something that a common misconception that's out there is that plants go through photosynthesis. Only photosynthesis. But if plants only went through photosynthesis, they would just be making sugars. They would never be getting energy, right? Because we have to have the process of cellular respiration to release the energy from those sugars. So plants go through both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, animals, such as you or this cute little squirrel here, have to consume their food. They can't use the process of photosynthesis to convert the sun's light into food. So they consume their food, and then they use that process of cellular respiration to release the energy from that food and to make ATP. And we're going to talk about ATP later. It's going to be a few teases throughout the lecture, and then eventually we will get to ATP. All right, so when we talk about the processes of photosynthesis and the processes of cellular respiration, we are talking about simply steps within a metabolic pathway. And a metabolic pathway is a series of chemical reactions that convert a starting molecule and convert it into another molecule and convert it into another molecule until you get to the finished molecule. All right, so for instance, if I start with a cheeseburger, it is not simply a one-step process to end up with ATP. I first have to go through, for instance, I have to break down the complex carbohydrates in the bun into simple sugars. And then I have to break simple sugars down. And then I have to do this, and then I have to do this. And then eventually I get to ATP. So this series of chemical reactions that takes the starting molecule and ends up with a finished molecule is called a metabolic pathway. All right? So there's multiple steps in these activities, or ultimate multiple steps to get from point A to point B. Two types of metabolic pathways in general. An anabolic pathway is a building pathway. So in an anabolic pathway, I'm going to take substrate A, or reactant A, and reactant B, or substrate B, and I'm going to build molecule AB. I am putting things together. Catabolic pathways break things down. So this would be if I were to take AB and break it down into its separate parts. Right? Now, in order for this anabolic pathway to occur, I have to add energy for the reaction to occur. And just like that, if I have a catabolic reaction, in order to break A and B apart, I am going to release energy. I'm building, I'm adding energy. If I'm breaking, I'm releasing energy. Together, when we look at anabolism and catabolism, we are talking about the process of metabolism. I put this in here, this metabolic pathway in here, because it kind of ties back to what we talked about in our last lecture. When we talked about how carbohydrates were the ultimate source of energy within living organisms. So their number one molecule is carbohydrates. The number two molecule is lipids. And the number three molecule is proteins. So first we want to break down carbohydrates. Then we want to break down lipids. And as a last resort, we break down proteins. Now, so this just illustrates all of the different reactions that have to occur in order for us to ultimately get to ATP synthesis. So all of these things can provide energy within a living organism, but it's not just a one-step reaction. We have all of these little sub-steps that we have to go through before we can even get to our goal. All right? Just a quick review here, just because it's interesting. Carbohydrates, our primary source of energy, if you look at this, has a pretty direct pathway to get to ATP synthesis. So essentially we go from carbohydrates all the way into citric acid cycle, cellular respiration, and then we result in ATP synthesis. Lipids, however, we have to get into the carbohydrate pathway, and then proteins have a completely different route. Our bodies are equipped to handle the carbohydrate pathway well and equipped to handle the lipid pathway well, but we don't handle the protein pathway very well. We go into ketogenesis, and that can cause some toxin buildup. All right. Another thing that I wanted to kind of point out here from our last lecture is that when we have excess carbohydrates, we have extra carbohydrates, we store them as lipids. So our bodies will convert them into lipids, and then we can convert them back out of lipids and then use them to make our ATP. All right, so anabolic pathways require energy in. These are building pathways. We are building. All right. So we are joining monomers together to make polymers. So an example would be when we are building proteins, where we take amino acids and we join them together, or when we take nucleotides and we make nucleic acids. These demand energy. So we have to add energy to the system in order to make the bonds. So if we're looking at our metabolic pathways diagram right here, anabolic is the top. Energy, the energy that we add to the system is essentially going to be stored in the bonds between the molecules. So energy has to be added into that system. Catabolic pathways we are breaking. Specifically, we're breaking the bonds that are holding the molecules together. So we're breaking down complex molecules, such as complex carbohydrates, into simpler molecules, such as glucose. The energy that are stored in those bonds, so if we go through and we break, so catabolic is right here, and we break these bonds, we are releasing energy. All right, now that energy is then taken and made into ATP. So here's your little teaser again. We're going to talk about ATP later. All right. Exergonic reactions are reactions where you are breaking down complex molecules. We are releasing energy. These tend to occur spontaneously, which means that they don't need very much energy, just a teensy bit of energy added to the system before they go. But no, typically very little energy is added or no energy is added. Energy leaves the system, and we have products that have less energy available to them than their original reactants. Remember this is exergonic is exit. So energy is exiting the system. So if we look at this graph, we can translate it. So let's say we have our reactants, and we have our reaction, and we have our products, right? So this little purple line is illustrating, our little purple line right here is illustrating the reaction portion. Okay. As the reaction goes on, energy is leaving that reaction. It's being released. Typically, it's being released as heat, right, into the ether, into the open system. So we are taking our reactant, and then we're creating a product, and we're losing energy. The energy is exiting the building. Exergonic reaction. Endergonic reactions are different. They require an input of energy to the system. So in order for this chemical reaction to occur, I have to add energy to that system. The products will have more energy in them than the reactants did. So you could say you are storing energy here. Way to remember it, endergonic is into. These are going to be catabolic or anabolic processes where we're building reactions. We're building large molecules. We are storing the energy that is added to the system within those large molecules. Typically, the energy added to the system is heat. All right, so we add heat to that system. What happens is the molecules within the system are going to start moving faster because when we add heat to molecules, they move faster. Since they're moving faster, they're more likely going to interact with each other, or they're going to collide with each other. And if they're interacting with each other or colliding with each other, they're more likely going to be able to form those bonds, and your reaction is going to occur faster. All right, so let's think about this. Exergonic, exit, heat is leaving, energy is leaving. Endergonic, heat is absorbed, or energy is absorbed. Let's change this to leaving. All right. Exergonic reactions are breaking down things, tend to be, and endergonic reactions tend to be building. So we have a compost pile. I don't think that's right. Compost. Oh, that's not right either. Spelling is not my forte. Compost pile. And we have developing chicks. All right. Which of these are anabolic or building? Which of these are catabolic or breaking? If you've ever been to a compost pile, you can feel the heat radiating off of that compost pile. Compost piles are catabolic. They are breaking down those materials in order to form more soils. When we're talking about developing chicks, we are building that chick from the material that's within that egg. So that is an anabolic process. Now, when we talk about chemical reactions, we also have to talk about chemical equilibrium. Now, chemical equilibrium is when chemical reactions, let's just model a reaction here where we have reactants and we have products. But what we have to remember is that the reaction can actually go both forwards and backwards, where our reactants go into our products and our products can go to our reactants. It goes both ways. At chemical equilibrium, the rate at which the reaction goes forward is the same as the rate at which the reaction goes backwards. So essentially, we get to the point where we are making products as fast as we are breaking down products. So you've leveled out. All right. Now, why is this an issue? If all cells were closed systems, meaning nothing can go in, right? So we're bouncing out here and nothing can go out. We're staying in the cell. Then the chemical reactions within those cells would be able to reach equilibrium, meaning that if I were a closed system, I would get to the point where I was breaking down materials at the same rate that I was producing energy. And my body would not be able to function because I couldn't get rid of waste products because I wouldn't have enough energy to build new proteins or build new structures. So if cells were closed systems, they would die. But thankfully, cells are open systems. So that means that I can move materials out of the cell and I can move materials into the cell. And the chemical reactions within that cell are always trying to move towards equilibrium. But because things can leave the cell, because products can leave the cell, they're never going to reach equilibrium because we can always add more reactants into the cell we're never going to reach equilibrium. And so our cells are able to function. Okay? Activation energy is the amount of energy a chemical reaction needs to have in order for it to occur. All right, so if we go back to this slide right here, this chemical reaction, let me erase it, start all over again. This chemical reaction will not occur until we have a certain amount of energy added to the system. This is their activation energy, the amount of energy we have to add in order for a reaction to occur. All right? And we're talking about types of reactions. Endergonic and exergonic have to have some activation energy. Exergonic reactions, only a little bit of energy has to be added to the system, but energy has to be added in order for that chemical reaction to occur. Like I said earlier, typically the energy that we're talking about is in the form of heat. So we add heat to that system, the molecules are going to start moving up faster, right? And if we're moving faster, then we're going to increase the chances that they're going to collide and interact. And if they can interact, they're going to bond, all right? We talked earlier about bumper cars. So if we have bumper cars and we start moving those bumper cars faster, then the chances that the bumper cars are going to hit each other is going to increase. You could also compare it to, say, junior high dance. So let's say at the start of the junior high dance, everyone's standing around the edge of the gym and just kind of staring at each other awkwardly, right? But if the right music comes on, if the kids feel comfortable enough, the energy in that room, in that gym is going to increase. They're going to start dancing and they're going to start interacting and they're going to start making connections, making friends, all right? So that would be kind of how activation energy works. We increase the energy in the room and then connections can be made. And that would be heat. And it could also be pressure. And this is how pressure cookers work, right? So cooking is a chemical reaction. We add heat to that food and it changes the structure of the food and it becomes what we call cooked, and then we eat, right? So we can do that with heat, but we can also do that with pressure. So if you have a pressure cooker or an Instapot, you are essentially creating a closed system and you're increasing the pressure within that system. And that's causing the molecules in that system to move faster and create heat and cook your food. And that chemical reaction happens faster. The amount of energy that a reaction requires determines the rate of that reaction. If the reaction requires a lot of energy, it's going to take a while for that system to build up the energy so the reaction can go. If the chemical reaction doesn't require a lot of energy, kind of like a spontaneous reaction, doesn't require a lot of energy, just a little bit, and then it can go a lot faster. So in order for most reactions within a cell to occur, the activation energy has to be decreased. So what I'm saying is that most of the chemical reactions within a cell, within a living system, has a high activation energy requirement. It needs a lot of energy added to the system in order for it to work. So we have to somehow decrease the amount of activation energy that reaction needs. And there are substances called catalysts. And a catalyst specifically decreases the amount of activation energy a reaction needs in order for it to occur, and so it can occur faster. So if I decrease the amount of activation energy needed by adding a catalyst to the system, I no longer have to store up this amount of energy. I can now just have to store up half the amount of energy in this example. All right, so it decreases the amount of activation energy needed to occur. And in the process of a catalyst decreasing that activation energy is called catalysis. You could compare it to a catalyst to a coupon. It's kind of like an energy coupon. So let's say that we're going to go jean shopping and we're going to buy a high-end pair of jeans and they cost $90. I only have $50. Okay? So in order for me to get that high-end pair of jeans, I have to save $40. But if I have a coupon in the form of a catalyst, that brings my price down, say maybe $75. So instead of having to save $90, I now only have to save $25. So I'm going to be able to get my high-end expensive jeans a lot faster. Okay. Now, we have to remember that the chemical reactions that we're talking about are breaking molecules or building molecules. When we're breaking molecules, we're releasing energy, and when we're building molecules, we're storing energy. And when we release energy, we take that energy and we form ATP molecules. So we're finally at the ATP slide. ATP is called adenosine triphosphate. So in the ATP molecule, you have an adenosine molecule, and then you have 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. So that's where we get our triphosphate. This is the energy supplying molecule of the cell. It is the energy currency. It powers the majority of energy requiring cell activities. So if there is an activity inside a cell, inside your body, that requires energy to function, it's functioning because of this ATP molecule right here. All right. Now, when we talk about ATP, we talk about how the bonds between your phosphate groups, right here and right here, are high energy. So when we break these bonds, we are releasing energy. When I make a bond, I'm storing energy, and when I break the bond, I'm releasing energy. Now, we talk about ATP being important for cellular function and cellular currency, and I've got a little kind of metaphor here that may help you understand it. So, we eat carbohydrates, we eat food, lipids, proteins, and we eventually take that, like we looked at that metabolic pathway at the beginning of the lecture, and we ultimately make ATP. All right. So, but we say that carbohydrates are our energy molecule, but we can't use carbohydrates to power cell functions. We have to use ATP. And it's kind of like when you get a check. Let's say you get a paycheck and you try to take that paycheck to Walmart and you get all your groceries and you get to the checkout line and you try to hand your paycheck over to the lady at the checkout line, and she says, I can't use this. This check isn't written to Walmart. We can't use this check. Does that mean the check doesn't have value? No, the check has a lot of value. You've worked hard for that paycheck. It's just not in the form that Walmart can accept as payment. All right? So what you do is you go and you cash that check. And then you take the cash. And then you pay for your groceries with the cash. Is it still currency? Yes. It just happens to be the type of currency that the store can take. It's the same way with glucose and ATP. Glucose has energy. It has energy stored within its bonds. It's just not in the form that a cell can use. So we have to convert the energy from the glucose into ATP, and we do that by storing energy in these high energy bonds. We store the energy from the glucose in these high energy bonds, and then our cells can use the ATP. All right? So it's very important. When the bond between the second and third phosphate group breaks, we release energy. So we have adenosine diphosphate and we release energy. Energy. If we were to break the bond between the first and second phosphate and adenosine diphosphate, we would release energy. And we would end up with a monophosphate, which means 1. All right. This brings us to our ATP-ADP cycle. Now, ATP is not a very stable molecule. It is constantly losing that third phosphate and converting to ADP. ADP is more stable. So ATP wants to be in the ADP form. But the processes within our body are constantly adding that third phosphate on so that they can store energy. And because it constantly flips between ATP, ADP, ATP, ADP, ATP, ADP, it's kind of like a rechargeable battery. It's kind of like the battery in your cell phone. You can use it and charge it, use it and charge it, use it and charge it. And it becomes a very versatile and important molecule for cell processes. So when I break the bond between the third and the second phosphate, I'm releasing energy. All right? So I'm releasing energy. When I add the phosphate back on, I am storing energy. So when I add that phosphate back to the ADP, I'm storing energy. It's kind of like your cell phone. Your cell phone plugged in is going to be ATP because it's got all of that energy being stored in that molecule. When you unplug that cell phone, when you remove that third phosphate, you're using the energy that's stored in that cell phone. You want to add energy back to your cell phone, you plug it back in. Plug that third phosphate back in, and you are storing energy in that molecule again. So the ability for our living systems to constantly recharge the ADP molecule by adding a phosphate back to it and creating ATP is a very important process because it allows us to take the energy that we're gaining from the food that we eat and storing it in a form that our cells can use to power processes. A very common example of a cell process that requires ATP is the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump is a type of active transport. Active transport is when we move molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration. And that's not the way molecules want to move. Molecules want to move from high concentration areas to low concentration areas. So when you're moving them against the flow of the stream, when you're moving them against the way they want to move, you have to have energy to power that. So if you look at this diagram, you have a high concentration of sodium molecules outside of the cell, but you don't have any. There's no sodium molecules inside of the cell. So naturally, the sodium molecules want to move in, but the sodium-potassium pump forces them out. Same way with potassium. You have a bunch of potassium molecules inside the cell. You don't have any potassium molecules outside of the cell because the cell is forcing those potassium molecules out. And they're doing that with the sodium-potassium pump right here. This is a protein transport, and what happens is when the ATP loses that phosphate and becomes ADP, the energy is charging that protein pump. And that energy is allowing that protein pump to push the sodium out of the cell and push the potassium into the cell.